So far, we've seen that nothing in Scripture prohibits Peter from being the rock of Matthew 16, and that there has actually been a long-standing Protestant scholarly consensus that Peter is the rock, based on both plain reason and critical biblical scholarship. But now it's time to turn to the meat of this video presentation and look at how the earliest Christian leaders and writers after the apostles interpreted the rock of Matthew 16. For those of you who might ask why you should care about the early church, I'd encourage you to check out my video on the different Protestant approaches to the early church fathers, as well as my video on why personal appeals to the Holy Spirit for your biblical interpretations are weak and invalid compared to the consensus interpretations of the fathers. Here is a quick visual summary of the rest of this video presentation, starting from the earliest interpreter of the Matthew 16 rock, namely Tertullian in the 2nd century, and ending with the 4th Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century. This visual chart speaks for itself, I think. No early church father or writer ultimately denied that Peter was the rock. Perhaps the closest person to do that was Augustine, but we will see that he was open to both interpretations at the end of his life. What do you think of my chart? I did my best to be thorough, but it may not be perfect. Do you wish to challenge its accuracy? Let me know down in the comment section. Perhaps more check marks could be added to the far right non-Petrine column, but that wouldn't impact or defeat the Catholic claim, since I will be providing the citations where they identify Peter also as the rock. I was reading through some materials on Steve Ray's website, and he claims that this idea of the rock being Peter's confession of Christ's divine status as the Son of the living God, that this idea became a popular rhetorical point against Arianism, and so that would be the reason why we find this so common in the early fathers. Now, I'm not sure how true that is, since there seem to be other, perhaps more decisive passages, anti-Arian passages that the early fathers used, but you can take that for whatever it's worth. The very first witness to how the early church interpreted the rock of Matthew 16 is Tatian, a disciple of Justin Martyr. His Diatessaron attempted to combine and harmonize the 4 Gospels. So even a little before Irenaeus, we have an early witness to 4 and only 4 Gospels, namely Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is also evidence against any wild, baseless conspiracy theory that Matthew 16:18 was interpolated into the Gospel of Matthew later. Unfortunately, Tatian doesn't provide any explicit commentary on Matthew 16:18, so it doesn't seem like we can put Tatian into either camp. Though Irenaeus' view of Peter and the Church of Rome are certainly compatible with Peter being the rock of Matthew 16:18, he apparently does not explicitly comment on Matthew 16:18 at all. That seems to be the case with Clement of Rome too. So Tertullian is apparently the earliest interpreter we have regarding the rock of Matthew 16. And he clearly says Peter is called the rock on which the church should be built. He goes on to say other things about Peter's keys and power, as well as his throne remaining in Rome, and his own authority coming down to Rome in his own day. In another later work, even during his heretical Montanist phase, I believe, Tertullian still affirms that Peter is the rock on which Jesus builds the church, and that Jesus conferred this gift along with the keys personally to Peter. In the early 3rd century, Hippolytus is our next witness, who says, "By this Spirit Peter spoke that blessed word, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. By this Spirit the rock of the church was established." Now, I imagine some might want to quibble with this passage, saying it's ambiguous, that the rock could be the blessed word spoken by Peter rather than Peter himself. But based on the parallel structure, it is much more likely that Hippolytus sees that Peter is the rock of the church. By the Spirit, Peter speaks. By the Spirit, Peter is established as the rock of the church. The next witness to Peter being the rock is pseudo-Clementine literature that represents itself as a letter from Clement to James and Clementine homilies. While these sources are not thought to be authentic and thus may have less weight, they are thought to be early and thus still represent early testimony to the early church believing Peter is the rock and foundation of the church. Origen is famous for his multiple and allegorical interpretations of Scripture, so it is no surprise that one of his interpretations of Matthew 16:18 would allegorize it to all believers. We see this in his own commentary on Matthew, when he says, we too can be like Peter or become a Peter. But even these allegorical interpretations would make no sense unless there was a already widespread understanding that the primary literal interpretation of the Matthew 16 rock is Peter. At the very least, it should be very clear that Origen did not exclude Peter from being the rock. Here we see a continuation of that passage from Origen's commentary on Matthew. Again, Origen is allegorically expanding upon the literal meaning of Peter being the rock that everyone already knew, saying that those who imitate Christ receive the surname of rock. But if we want to know what Origen thought about the rock of Matthew 16:18, we need to do our best to look at all his works to see how he refers to Peter. Both the quotes from his commentary on Matthew that we saw previously fit in with the Catholic position that the rock is Peter, but can also be used to allegorically refer to Christ or Christians generally. In his commentary on John, we see Origen explicitly say that the Church of Christ is built upon Peter, thus making Peter the rock. In his homilies on Exodus, Origen refers to Peter as the great foundation of the church and that most solid of rocks upon whom Christ built the church. Doesn't get any more clearer than that, I think. These are the statements of Origen that Peter is the rock that many Protestants are unaware of or neglect to cite and take into account. In Cyprian's writings on the unity of the church, we see that Cyprian quotes Matthew 16:18 and then explicitly says Christ builds the church on Peter, thus making Peter to be the rock. He goes on to say quite a bit more about Peter and Peter's chair, authority, and primacy, but you can pause the video and read that for yourself if you like. Here is the second edition or version on the previous passage, which Cyprian likely wrote later on after his dispute with Pope Stephen. This edition is less explicit, but still sees Peter as foundational, as the origin of church unity that one must hold to hold the faith and be in the church. But this edition does not actually contradict what Cyprian said in his first edition or in his other writings, as we shall see. In this letter, Cyprian explicitly refers to Peter here as the one on whom the church was built, and thus implicitly but clearly believes Peter to be the rock. He also says Peter teaches in the name of the church. The context is Cyprian quoting the end of John chapter 6, where some of Jesus' disciples leave him because of his bread of life discourse, which Cyprian uses as an example of Christians who leave Christ in the church. His main point here is that even though a rebellious and arrogant multitude disobey and depart, the church still remains one and united to Christ, but you can read it for yourself for the details. Again, similarly in this letter, Cyprian explicitly refers to Peter here as the one on whom the church was built, and thus implicitly but clearly believes Peter to be the rock. He also refers to Peter as speaking for all and with the voice of the church. Moving on to Eusebius, I was able to verify at least one citation where he refers to the rock of the faith of Christ, which seems a little odd to refer to the faith of Christ as if Christ had faith. I was not able to verify another common Protestant citation of Eusebius's commentary on the Psalms, which also associates the rock with Christ. But anyway, these citations seem impressive at first, but has the Protestant looked at all his writings and at every way that Eusebius interprets Matthew 16:18? We need only look at another, more famous work of Eusebius to see he does not exclude Peter from being the rock. Here in Eusebius's church history, his most famous work, we see he clearly believes the church of Christ was built on Peter, thus making Peter the rock. This is the statement of Eusebius that Peter is the rock that many Protestants are unaware of and neglect to cite and take into account. Interestingly, the context of this statement is the biblical canon of the New Testament, in which Eusebius says Peter left us one epistle, with a second one being doubtful. Statements like this gravely undermine Protestant claims about how the New Testament canon came about and came to be settled. It was not obvious to everyone that Peter's second letter was genuine and inspired. Speaking of controversy over the canon of Scripture, please check out my videos on the biblical canon, where I show the evidence for the larger Catholic biblical canon based on Jewish reception, early church usage, the universal acceptance of the North African councils throughout the worldwide church, and a timeline proof of how Jerome apparently changed his mind on the biblical canon a couple times, or at least softened his rejection of the Deuterocanon later in life. Let's move on to a less well-known early church father, Aphrodites, who was a Persian and Syriac bishop and abbot. In his demonstration on penitence, he clearly says Simon Peter was set up as the foundation and called the rock and structure of the church by the Lord. This testimony from Aphrodites proves that the belief that Peter is the rock was widespread, even in the Syriac church. Another Syriac church father is Ephraim. In one of his homilies, he paraphrases Jesus' words, saying that Jesus made Simon Peter to be the foundation of the Holy Church, and so Ephraim clearly believes Peter to be the rock of Matthew 16. Interestingly, he also says Peter is the inspector who condemns those who build falsely, and that Peter is the head of the fountain from which Jesus' teaching flows, and that Peter is the chief of Jesus' disciples. Optatus of Miletus points out the obvious fact that Peter was called Kephas, which means rock. But he doesn't explicitly say Peter is the rock of Matthew 16. Regardless, everything else Optatus says fits in with the Catholic view of Peter and his successors. Optatus might just be one of the most early and explicit witnesses to the indefectibility of Petrine succession in Rome, where the keys in the chair of Peter can be found. Interestingly, in reference to Matthew 16, he says it's the keys Peter received that the gates of hell shall not overcome. And clearly the keys belong to the chair of Peter, to the line of Peter at Rome. Unlike the Donatists, Optatus is in communion with Rome, which has the chair or cathedra of Peter, through the line of Peter. Here is the citation of Hilary of Poitiers that many Protestants will cite against the Catholic belief that Peter is the rock. In this passage, we see Hilary refers to the rock as Peter's confession and Peter's faith. Seems pretty impressive at first, but if the Protestant would just look at the primary source context for himself, he would notice something very interesting in the very same work, in the very same 6th book, just several passages earlier. In the very same work, in the same 6th book, just several passages earlier, we see Hilary saying that Simon Peter was set to be the foundation stone of the church. Like the Catholic Church, Hilary believes that the rock refers to both Peter himself and his confession of faith. This is the statement of Hilary that Peter is the rock that many Protestants are unaware of or neglect to cite and take into account. So much for Hilary being a witness to the non-Catholic position against Peter being the rock. If you're going to take exclusive claims or make exclusive claims, like a particular church father believes the rock is not Peter, but something else, you better do your due diligence to make sure that church father doesn't call Peter the rock elsewhere in his writings. Here we have another and even more egregious example of non-Catholics not going back to the primary source to double-check the context. In this particular passage, Gregory of Nyssa refers to Peter's firm faith as the foundation of the church. To the lazy and sloppy, this might seem impressive and conclusive. But guess what Gregory of Nyssa says in the same passage of the same work just a little earlier? In the same passage of the same work just a little earlier, we find Gregory of Nyssa saying, Peter, the chief of the apostles, is recalled, and the remaining members of the church are glorified with him, for indeed the church of God is established upon him. This is in accord with the Lord's words, who made him the firm and most solid rock upon which he had built his church. And then he goes on to reference Matthew 16. This is the statement of Gregory of Nyssa that Peter is the rock that many Protestants are unaware of and neglect to cite and take into account. So much for Gregory of Nyssa being a witness for the Protestant or Eastern Orthodox position on this topic. In his commentary on Isaiah, Basil the Great, while interpreting Isaiah 2:2, says, One such mountain was also Peter, and the Lord promised to build his church upon this rock. For high and elevated thoughts transcending earthly things are fitly referred to as mountains. The soul of the blessed Peter has been called a high rock, because it is firmly rooted in faith and is steadfast and unyielding towards the blows directed against it by temptations. So, Basil is yet another witness to Peter being the rock. Gregory Nazianzus provides us with more patristic testimony to Peter being the rock. While I was not able to put my eyes on these quotations myself in the primary sources, I did find them being quoted in a Protestant master's thesis written under the supervision of Professor Daniel B. Wallace of Dallas Theological Seminary, and that thesis cited credible enough sources. So with that caveat, we can clearly see Gregory here says Peter is called rock, and only him out of the disciples of Christ. And then in another work, he explicitly refers to Peter as the one who became the unbroken rock and had the keys delivered to him. Epiphanius, in his Ancoratus, calls Peter the greatest and first of the apostles, the solid rock on which the church of God is built and which the gates of Hades will not overpower. Interestingly, like other fathers I've seen, he identifies the gates of Hades with heresies and the leaders of heresies. In this excerpt, he also calls Peter the foundation of the scrutiny of the faith. There is no doubt Epiphanius is talking about Peter here, since he refers to an apostle who was blessed by the Lord because of something the Father revealed to him. Epiphanius is yet another witness to Peter being the rock. As with Hilary and Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom is yet another example of how non-Catholics often fail to read the primary sources for themselves and do some due diligence to research how a father refers to Peter throughout their writings. Here in some homilies on Matthew and John, we see Chrysostom identifying the rock of Matthew 16 with the faith or confession of Peter. But by now you should know that that's not the only way Chrysostom referred to the rock. If one merely reads an earlier homily on Matthew, and merely reads further on in that very same homily 54, we see Chrysostom referring to Peter as a foundation of the church and more solid than any rock. In another homily, he calls Peter the foundation of the faith and the base of the confession. In another work on almsgiving, he calls Peter an unbreakable rock and an immovable ridge. These are the statements of Chrysostom that Peter is the rock that many non-Catholics are unaware of and neglect to cite and take into account. So much for Chrysostom being a witness for the Protestant or Eastern Orthodox position on this topic. In his work against Jovinian, Jerome does not dispute the fact that the church was founded upon Peter. Thus, implicitly but clearly, he accepts the fact that Peter is the rock of Matthew 16. In fact, he goes on to say that one was chosen to be the head of the 12 in order to remove any occasion for division. And in his letter 15 to Pope Damasus, Jerome goes even further than Peter himself and claims that Peter's chair, held by Pope Damasus, is the rock on which the church has been built. He goes on to use other images like the Passover and Noah's Ark and flood to emphasize the necessity of communion with the chair of Peter at Rome. Very clear Catholic witness from Jerome. Our next witness is Ambrose of Milan. You might find some non-Catholics claiming that he believes the rock of Matthew 16 is only Peter's confession or faith. Here's one such passage they might point to support this, which emphasizes Peter's confession of faith. It should be pointed out that Catholicism also does not teach that it is Peter's flesh that is the rock that hell will not prevail against. That would be a straw man. However, if we just read the passage in context, we can see that it is not the case that Ambrose denies Peter to be the rock. If we read just a little before this excerpt, we can see that Ambrose calls Peter the foundation and says Peter knows how to preserve the common foundation of the church. So, in context, this particular excerpt affirms both Peter and his confession of faith, not just his confession of faith. In another work, Ambrose provides some prophetic commentary on this debate between Catholics and non-Catholics on whether Peter is the rock. He says, "Great is the grace of Christ, who has imparted almost all his own names to his disciples. I am," said he, "the light of the world, and yet with that very name in which he glories, he favored his disciples, saying, Ye are the light of the world. I am the living bread, and we are all one bread. Christ is the rock, for," and then he quotes 1 Corinthians 10:4, but then he says, "Also he denied not to his disciple the grace of this name," namely rock, "that he should be Peter, because he has from the rock the solidity of constancy, the firmness of faith." And then he goes on to allegorize it in encouraging all Christians to be a rock and to make your faith your rock. So, even though Catholics would agree with Ambrose that Christ is the rock in the ultimate sense, Ambrose makes it clear that Christ is not jealous about names and titles and actually shares his own names with his disciples. I really think Ambrose would be puzzled and impatient with non-Catholics who are more jealous than Jesus of the title rock and who try to deny to Peter the title that his very name means. Let's wrap up our testimony from Ambrose with some clear, explicit statements from him that Peter is the rock of Matthew 16. In his work on the Christian faith, Ambrose uses a rhetorical question to assert that Christ calls Peter the rock, thereby declaring him to be the foundation of the church. Quoting the Petrine passages Luke 22:32 and Matthew 16:18, Ambrose also says Christ strengthens the faith of Peter and gave the kingdom to Peter. In another work, Ambrose quotes Matthew 16:18 as what Christ said to Peter and asserts that where Peter is, there is the church. But if Peter died in the first century, then where is the church after his death? The early church always gave the answer Rome, where the seat and authority of Peter lives on, as I showed in my video on whether Rome could lose its primacy. We come at last to the great Augustine. Now, I'm not going to bother quoting everything Augustine wrote on this topic of who or what the rock of Matthew 16 is, but I will start by quoting a couple popular passages that non-Catholics like to cherry pick and use against the idea of Peter being the rock. In this first citation, Homily 10 on 1 John, Augustine identifies the rock as the faith confessed by Peter. In Sermon 229p, we get perhaps the best citation non-Catholics can offer, since in it he says Christ built his church not on a man, but on Peter's confession. However, interestingly, even in this citation, it's important to notice that Augustine still clearly calls Peter the rock multiple times, with the translator emphasizing or clarifying this point from the Latin by saying in an endnote that he'll have to translate Peter as rocky. It's also worth pointing out that Augustine seems to be merely emphasizing the derivative nature of Peter as the rock. Peter is called rocky from Christ the rock, just as we are called Christians from Jesus' title, the Christ. So even here, we can say Augustine is saying the rock is not merely the human being Peter, but Peter elevated by Christ because of his confession. Also worth pointing out how Augustine echoes other church fathers in identifying the gates of Hades or the underworld with heretics and their prideful heresies. And in relation to the Christian sharing in the name and title of Christ or Messiah, he echoes Ambrose in saying that Christ is not jealous of his own names and titles, but shares them with his disciples. Because Augustine wrote so much, I think the best and most efficient thing to do is to go to Augustine's last finished work, Retractationes, sometimes called retractions or revisions or corrections in English. In this work, he looks back over his prior writings and offers additional thoughts, and this topic is one of the ones he covers. Augustine says that earlier on in his writings, he said Peter was the rock the church was built on, echoing a song of Ambrose that expresses the same idea. And so Augustine here gives us even more evidence that Ambrose believed Peter was the rock, and not just Christ or Peter's faith. But then Augustine says later he frequently explained the rock to be Christ. Interestingly, he doesn't mention anything here about Peter's faith or confession, just Peter and Christ. He concludes the topic by implicitly saying both interpretations are equally valid, saying, let the reader decide which of these two opinions is the more probable. So he does that rather than imposing one rigid interpretation. But before we wrap up Augustine, let's look at some passages where he clearly associates Peter with being the rock. In a work against the Donatists, Augustine says the seat or chair of Peter in the Petrine succession of popes, itself associated with that chair, is itself the rock that cannot be conquered and thus cannot lose its primacy and authority. And in case there's any doubt, in another passage we clearly see that Augustine affirms that it is the Roman Church that possesses the Petrine succession and thus Peter's seat or chair. This is a powerful testimony from the most revered and prolific early church father to the indefectibility of the papal successors to Peter in Rome, especially when we remember he considered the gates of Hades to be heresies and heretics. Lastly, in Letter 53, Augustine discusses the Petrine succession of bishops at Rome and the certainty and benefit it gives to the church, quoting Matthew 16:18. And as I show in my video on Paul's rebuke of Peter, Augustine did not believe that the sin or scandal of church leaders took away their authority, even if a traitor to the church had obtained the papal throne. In fact, he says that the Lord provided for such a case concerning wicked clergy, appealing to Matthew 23, which references the seat of Moses and affirms the authority of religious leaders, even as the faithful are to reject and not imitate their leaders' sinful and scandalous behavior. Augustine reaffirms the stability of Peter and his successors at Rome being fixed in the Lord and thus not being able to be swept away, which evokes the parable of Matthew 7 with the two houses built on rock and sand. In this context, we can see Augustine says the rock is not Peter the man merely to emphasize Christ's providence of stability in Peter and his successors. In that case, the rock includes the Roman succession of bishops. In the Third Ecumenical Council at Ephesus, we find the earliest and most explicit affirmation by the whole universal church of Peter being the prince and head of the apostles, pillar of the faith, and foundation of the Catholic Church, clearly hearkening to the language of the rock in Matthew 16. The council also asserts the permanent and inseparable unity of Peter's authority and the authority of his successors, the popes at Rome. Our very last witness to Peter being the rock is Pope Leo the Great and the Ecumenical Council, which affirmed his teachings. Here in Sermon 51, Leo says Peter received the fullness of blessing and was endued with the holy firmness of the inviolable rock on which the church should be built and conquer the gates of hell and the laws of death, so that in loosing or binding the petitions of any whatsoever, only that should be ratified in heaven which had been settled by the judgment of Peter. In this particular passage, it is a little ambiguous whether Leo is directly calling Peter the rock of Matthew 16, but without a doubt he asserts that Peter has the holy firmness of the inviolable rock on which the church is built and conquers hell and death. It will become clearer in the following passages that Leo affirms both Peter and Christ to be the rock. Interestingly, the end of this passage says that only what is settled by Peter's judgment is ratified in heaven. Here in Sermon 3, on the anniversary of his becoming pope, Leo says, "The strength of the foundation on which the whole superstructure of the church is reared is not weakened, for the solidity of that faith which was praised in the chief of the apostles is perpetual, and as that remains which Peter believed in Christ, so that remains which Christ instituted in Peter. For when, as has been read in the gospel lesson," and then he quotes the relevant passage from Matthew 16. He continues, "The dispensation of truth, therefore, abides, and the blessed Peter, persevering in the strength of the rock which he has received, has not abandoned the helm of the church." This excerpt concludes with Leo saying that Peter's confession transcended all the uncertainty of human opinions and was endued with the firmness of a rock which no assaults could shake. Again, this passage is somewhat ambiguous about who the rock is and seems to imply both Christ and Peter. Additionally, this whole passage speaks explicitly to papal supremacy and papal indefectibility, as even various prominent non-Catholic scholars admit. Here in letter 10, we have a more clear and explicit reference to Peter being the rock. Leo says, "Anyone who dares to secede from Peter's solid rock may understand that he has no part or lot in the divine mystery, for he wished him who had been received into partnership in his undivided unity to be named what he himself was, when he said," and then he quotes Matthew 16:18, "that the building of the eternal temple by the wondrous gift of God's grace might rest on Peter's solid rock, strengthening his church so surely that neither could human rashness assail it, nor the gates of hell prevail against it." Like Ambrose and Augustine, Leo quotes Matthew 16:18, saying Jesus is not jealous of his own names and titles, but wished Peter to be named what he himself was. Additionally, Leo sees this rock status of Peter as relevant and crucial for unifying and strengthening the church of his own time. As is clear in other passages, Leo believes his office as Bishop of Rome is Peter's rock, such that the gates of hell cannot prevail against Rome, and those who secede from Rome have no part in the divine mystery. Here in Sermon 5, Pope Leo very clearly and explicitly alludes to Matthew 16, saying Christ made Peter to be the rock, and that Peter received his solidity from Christ the rock. Additionally, Leo says this rocky solidity and nature of Peter was passed on to Peter's heirs, namely the bishops of Rome, such that when the popes show forth their firmness, we can be certain we are witnessing the strength of the shepherd, who is both Christ the good shepherd and Peter, to whom Christ entrusted all his sheep in John 21. Leo asks rhetorically, who can be so ignorant or so envious to believe there are parts of the church not governed by Peter, who never ceases to preside over his see in his successors at Rome? If the prior ecumenical council of Ephesus was not clear and explicit enough, the Fourth Ecumenical Council at Chalcedon in 451 AD explicitly says Peter the Apostle is the rock and foundation of the Catholic Church and the foundation of the Orthodox faith. Again, here we have the whole church, minus the Oriental non-Chalcedonians, affirming that Peter is the rock of the church, clearly alluding to Matthew 16:18.